Good morning. Wow, what a great crowd. You guys all came back. That's awesome. For those of you who weren't here yesterday or weren't here yesterday morning, my name is Ruth Milligan, and I will be your panel facilitator today, which is my pleasure and honor. Thank you very much to Reagan for allowing me this opportunity. My background is in communication, speech communication, coaching and training, and my role here today is to help bring the best out of this panel and get you guys to ask great questions around the notion of how do we bring insights to the business. And our panelists are esteemed and experienced, and I'm excited to be with them today. So I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then they're going to do a little bit more on their own in a few minutes of bringing one insight that they wanted to bring to each of them to bring an insight to you to start off this conversation. So on the far left is Jen Brett. She's head of insights for the Americas at LinkedIn, and she's come to us from New York City. But she originally hails from Ireland. I actually didn't ask, are you from Dublin?
I am from Dublin.
She's from Dublin. You'll hear it in her accent. Where she also worked for LinkedIn over in the European sector, right?
Yeah.
And on the couch is May Alowaish. She's actually come down from Akron, and she runs I have to look at my notes. She works for Blast Analytics. She's an analyst and a consultant to major companies. She actually has a master's degree from Northwestern. And I'm going to go back to Jen. By the way, we have two Jens in the panel. So we're going to call them Jen B and Jen H, so we don't get them confused. But I will come back to Jen B and a degree that she has and tying it back to a question later. And then we have Jen H, who spent time at IBM and Express, but currently is at the Huntington as an insights analyst, and she is a Buckeye. So help me welcome the panel to the stage, everyone. So like I said, the format is going to be, they're just going to sit and share an insight, and then we're going to start a conversation on the stage, and then we're going to toss it to you. So please start to think about questions that you may want to get answered. So I'm going to ask May to kick us off.
Okay, I'm a digital analyst, so what some of you call web analytics. And I remember when I first started building websites in 1997, and analytics to us back then was that, hit counter on the bottom of the homepage, adding +1 every time you refresh the page. And that was our analytics. But now we have an overflow of data. And when clients come to us, they wanting to adopt the hot and latest data science technology, I always ask them, so show me your data. And they go, well, we have our CRM, we have our transactional databases, offline transactions. And that's when I look at them and say, let's go hunting for data, of course. So think of data as your raw materials for data science. And it is important that you find and define your data and go beyond your your transactional and traditional databases. You need to find relevant data sources. When I say relevant, I mean relevant to your business objectives. And the first step to do that is you draw an analytics framework, or what I like to call a blueprint. So let's walk through one. My example here is this website, AirXYZ, which works exactly like Airbnb. When I look at this, the first thing we start is the objective is we want to provide customer with enough information to make bookings. So when we translate that objectives into goals, our goals will be complete bookings, view properties, people contact the hosts, and how to measure these goals is, conversion rate, bookings, revenue, and all that information, and we need supporting metrics. Once you do all of that for your objectives, you have a mini blueprint that has, what you want to measure and what you don't want to measure that's not here. Then you can extend this further. You have, you add your data sources for all of these metrics, and then you also include information about your desired changes, or what do you want to come out of data science, like optimizations. So you do this for all of your objectives, and you have a blueprint. Now, think of this blueprint as a living document. It is your responsibility to evolve it as your business grows, to review it regularly, and keep it alive. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, May. We're going to come back and ask May questions in a minute, but we're going to let the other two share their insights, and then we'll start our round robin. So, ready?
Yes. So I spent several years in data science consulting, where I was cross-sector, so I saw data science in industries anywhere from healthcare to retail to financial services, and even federal as well. And then I moved into retail, as Ruth mentioned, where I was part of a pretty young analytics organization. So I got to be part of a lot of interesting conversations around what best practices we wanted to put in place, building repeatable processes, documentation that we wanted to have going forward. And then more recently, I moved over to Huntington, where I'm part of a more mature analytics organization, and I'm having a blast so far, learning from the best practices that that team already has in place. And I've seen from all these different experiences the consistent theme that analytics without context is way less valuable than analytics done in the context of the business needs. So I have a story to kind of illustrate that point. So this is something I saw in my past life. An executive needed either month-end or quarter-end numbers, and so they made a list of the specific data points that they thought would help fill out the PowerPoint presentation that they were throwing together, and then they sent them over to the wall to several analytics managers or directors. And then if we panned over to the analytics team, we see that get disseminated across the different analysts, and they drop everything else they're working on, anything longer term, and go heads down for the next day or week in some cases, and then kind of throw the numbers back over the wall to the executives, and hopefully it's what they're looking for. But then, of course, the executives might have some follow-up questions, or this isn't exactly what I thought I was asking you for, send it back, and then the team ends up spending a lot of time iterating back and forth, trying to get the numbers that they're asking for. And I have a number of different concerns about this scenario. So first of all, what are those numbers actually being used for? Hopefully it's not just a curiosity exercise, but oftentimes you'll see we're asking for numbers to try to tell a certain story rather than what we should be doing, which is, what question are we trying to answer? Are we trying to make a decision? Let's have a conversation about what decision we're trying to make. And maybe we already ran some reports that we can pull these numbers from. Maybe we don't need to use additional computing resources to build something that's just similar to what we've already done. And also from the analytics team perspective, that can be really frustrating. That's bad for morale to not have any context, not know what your numbers are even being used for eventually. It's kind of an empty transaction. So I have 3 specific recommendations for the executives in that scenario, and 3 specific recommendations for the analysts or data scientists in that scenario. So for the executives, first of all, make sure that your analytics teams know your short list of strategic priorities and use those strategic priorities as the ruler by which to measure any new analytics projects that you're undertaking. If we're saying something is important to us, are we actually using our analysts' time on what we're saying is important to us? Because hopefully we are. 2, reward your analytics teams and incentivize them based on the value they're creating, not the volume or the complexity that they're creating. And thirdly, hire for more than just the technical skills. Encourage your teams to be very collaborative, have soft skills, and to interact frequently with the business to understand the context with which their numbers are being used. And from the analyst side, so the other side of the coin, but very related advice, so first of all, make sure you understand their strategic priorities. If you're being asked to do something that you feel is not in line with the strategic priorities, you should maybe question that and say, should we be spending time on this? What decision are we making with this? And maybe it is a valuable exercise, but I think it's okay to ask that question. Secondly, don't add complexity for the sake of complexity. Start simple first. Start with what will add the most value the most quickly. And thirdly, focus on your soft skills as well. And this can be somewhat of a challenge because in school, a lot of us come from quantitative majors. We're not necessarily trained in the soft skills. So continue to develop yourself, continue to engage with the business, and seek feedback on your communication skills. So those are my recommendations for how to help data scientists be more in context. And I'm really honored to be up here today with May and Jen, and I'm excited for the rest of the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Awesome. So a nice bridge on the word feedback. So we'll let Jen Brett share her insight now.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. I think it's interesting actually listening to Jen H's comments in particular. So I've been at LinkedIn for almost 6 years and have seen our what we call our insights team, effectively our kind of like internal analytics team, really evolve in that time. And I would say one area we really focused on for a long time was actually improving that internal alignment and thinking of like the impact that you can have with your insights. Like how do you really effectively bring them to the business? You want them to be relevant, you want them to be valuable. I feel the stage that we have moved into now is how do you create processes to ensure that the insights you have brought to the business remain relevant and valuable over time. I think there can be a bit of this idea of, we launched and we're done, and like the insight is out there and that's fantastic, I'm off to the next thing. But actually a big part of your ongoing success, your ongoing credibility, and how you add value to the business is how do you constantly iterate and keep up to date the tools and the insights that you have already brought to your business partners. And I think like probably the key takeaway that I would have from the session today is just don't fall into the trap of believing that the insights you produce are evergreen. This fit a certain point in time, and therefore it will always work. In particular, at LinkedIn, my team actually works within our marketing advertising business. And the marketing industry in particular is a very fast-paced industry. It's constantly moving, constantly changing. It's a very competitive industry. And so quite simply, the insights that we create at any one point are just not going to be the same exact thing that is needed 6, 12, 18 months down the road. And I said I've been at LinkedIn for 6 years, so I've seen us release some really great internal tools that we make self-serve to our partners. And it's great. You have this initial excitement. You've launched something. You get lots of really positive feedback. People are really excited to have access to it. And then I consistently see that over time, it just stops meeting expectations. And suddenly people are like, oh, that tool, that thing, I don't really like that. I don't use that as much as I used to. And if you have stayed constant, the expectations in the business change. And so what you need to have in place, and I think we'll chat about it a little bit later, is how do you have these feedback processes in place? Is there a channel from which your partners can provide that? Is there a channel from which you can obtain it? Is one part, but then I think with some of the interesting discussions that we're having as internal analytics team more broadly is how do you resource for that? So often we think about value as an analytics team as the new things we're producing. That's often where kind of recognition can come from, like we've created something new or launched something new. So how do you also put resource as a team against keeping what is there already relevant and still adding value, and having that balance between the new and the current, I think it's an interesting conversation, one that we're still having internally, to be honest. I think this is kind of an ongoing thing that we're still working through. But yes, I think that for me is probably one of the key things that we're now thinking about when we talk about bringing insights to the business.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to run the first round of questions, and then we're going to let them, if they have questions between each other, let them ask a few, and then toss it to you all. So that's what we're going to move forward with. So the tech team hates it when I do things like this, but I'm going to ask them to pull May's last slide up, just because I think we went through it pretty fast, and giving them a chance to do so. And just give you a chance to follow up, I want to talk a little about the difference between, so we're going back to the blueprint, and the notion of customizing it versus automating it, and sort of how you view that in terms of scaling it so that it's constantly working for you.
So once we build that blueprint around the business objectives, we already defined how each goal or each objective goes down all the way to KPIs, to supporting metrics. So we already have outlined, as you see here, for example, for the first goal, for complete bookings, I already defined what I want to measure, what I want to do with the data, I have a plan for my insights. This is ready to go to the next step of data science adoption to start your self-service analytics. And self-service analytics is an important, part of your overall data governance puzzle. So I already know the dashboard that I need for the people who are taking care of bookings. They know the metrics, they know the data sources, and they want to optimize to increase conversion rate. Once you have that piece, you set, your insights and action ready for your, business team to look at their results.
How hard is this to bring a team, in terms of thinking about change management for those of you in the audience who may not have a blueprint? What does that feel like to actually move them to one and get them to adopt one?
With data science adoption, I think it comes hand in hand to organization-wide to develop a culture of intentional self-service analytics. You need to have, give access to everyone. And when I say give access to everyone, it's not give access to the wild and everyone has access to the data. Instead, give access to business teams to data that is relevant to them in a controlled environment. So each team has access to the dashboards, to the data that is relevant to what they're measuring, what they're working on. So they are empowered to, share their own insights, to answer their own questions, to be able to make data-driven decisions, without going back to the analysts.
Great. Did you guys have any follow-ups for May on that?
Just that, yeah, I agree with we sort of talk about empowering our stakeholders internally to have access to data themselves. So also, I think particularly putting it in language that sounds positive. We're actually having conversations at the moment as to whether self-serve is the right term to use. Does that sound a little bit like, oh, I'm not getting the really great stuff, or custom, or like personalization is what I would like? So we're talking about things like insights being available on demand to you. Right. But that idea of empowering internal stakeholders to do that themselves.
So Jen H., that falls right back to the topic you were discussing around sort of the difference between lower impact and things that are driving results. And if analysts are working on things that are lower impact that might be able to be self-served, if you will, how do you think about moving your team to those higher impact? I mean, what are you doing to help your team think about the driving results versus just delivering on what's requested?
I think it's a real challenge because it requires a mindset change, right? And you kind of get in a routine of doing things the same way every day. And so it takes repetition to think outside the box and what can we automate, what can we do differently. And I'd love to hear ideas from Jen or May on how to not only get people to use self-service, but then also get your analysts to stop doing the work for them, right?
I think one part of it is you train the users to use these tools, but what is more important is to train the users to learn the intricacies of the data that they're using. It's not about just the tools. It goes hand in hand. They need to understand what they're using, where this data comes from, the documentation of this blueprint that you started with. You should have something like a center of excellence, we call it, like, a little wiki, a space on your, company wiki, how to use this data, templates, like recorded video sessions. I know new hires love, working with, looking at these video sessions and training to, be up to date and to really have easier access to be empowered to use these tools. And this will, free up your analysts to kind of focus on more impactful analysis instead of answering those day-to-day questions and ad hoc reports.
That's a big part of my job, is keeping my team orientated towards the higher value, higher impact projects, which I firmly believe is the best way we add value for the business. The process to get there can be slow, and I think it comes on two different sides. I would say it's the stakeholder side, and then it's also the team side. On the stakeholders, I have had and continue to sort of reiterate a lot of conversations around what my team spends time on and what they should be spending time on. And one of the lines that I have used with my stakeholders is, like, what is my team uniquely positioned to do? So we can do a lot of stuff, but if you think about things that only my team can do for you, that's what you want us focused on. And so I think part of it is getting them, as you said, the mindset of the stakeholders being like, okay, yes, actually these things don't sound so high value, but if you do this, that sounds great. When you do high value work, promote it. That's the other way to get stakeholders to be like, oh, great, you should do more of this. So there are some of the tactics that I've used with the stakeholders. And then on my team side, I basically tell them that, like, I'll be the bad cop. So I will, if they're facing a situation where a stakeholder is really like, I don't want to do this, I don't care if it's self-serve, I am willing to step in those situations and say, no, like, I'm drawing the line. This is not my analyst's fault. Like, I have actually laid this out as new kind of ground rules that the team has. And so I think on the analyst level, and this can really vary with the seniority of the person, but I think knowing that you have their back, in a sense, that you have approved this, that you want them focused on these other things, and you've clearly articulated that to your team, and that you will support them in saying no to things that are available self-serve. I think that's a really important part of getting them into the mindset as well.
So Jen, just keep following up on that theme around your stakeholders. And we've talked about how, like, this is my philosophy is you can train people on how you want them to communicate with you. And sort of how you train the stakeholders on giving you feedback, and talk about your efforts to do that.
Yeah, I think if I think about feedback specifically for the insights we provide or for the tools that we build, we try and set up quite formalized channels for feedback so that from the stakeholders' perspective, it feels like an easy thing to do, and it's something that they can remember. So within our main self-service tool platform, we actually have a drop-down which directly links through to provide feedback, which creates a ticket, and that goes directly to the team that builds and maintains those tools. So having a system in place that is just simple to follow, I think, is a key one. Regardless, they still don't always do that. And so I think part of it is, the other two things I would add is, one is just be proactive. We try and ask for feedback ourselves pretty regularly internally. So sending surveys to our stakeholders is one channel. And I think then the other is also, they sort of say people need to hear things roughly 7 times before they remember it. So when you're telling people how to provide feedback, don't think you're over-communicating. Just keep telling them over and over again, oh, by the way, did you know you can log a ticket here, that you can just click on this drop-down, and this will enable you to provide feedback. But just find multiple channels to communicate that and keep communicating it. Don't worry about saying it too much.
Do you have any successes in that area, Jen, each?
Yeah, I mean, like she said, it's very iterative, and I think that if you can continue to gently explain things when you're presenting them. Nobody wants to be told straight up, I don't think you understand the statistical concept, so I'm going to explain it to you. But if you...
You're very dumb.
Yeah, I
and we're
think you
smart.
don't understand. No, but if you frame up when you're presenting a conversation, if you have slides or numbers on charts and you just gently say, I'm going to just frame this up for everybody to make sure we're all on the same page, and then you use the types of words that they should be using when they're interpreting your numbers or your charts, then that kind of is a subtle training process, I think, with your stakeholders about the types of words we're using, how we're interpreting things, and I think that ongoing relationship can be really beneficial because once they start learning the language, they can feel more confident speaking up, because no one wants to raise their hand and say, I don't remember what I learned in college statistics. Can you? So I think that if you can really facilitate that relationship, that can really come in handy.
So making your language accessible,
Yeah.
so that they don't have to know all the technical, taking yourself out of your lab and realizing that they don't work in your lab per se.
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw one question to all of them that we were discussing backstage, and then we'll take it to the audience, which is, as you're thinking about hiring a team, and the core competencies that you want. And there's a great Harvard Business Review article that came out in January, February. It was called The Art of Persuasion, Data Science. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. It sort of categorized the core competencies that a data science team needs. But you could probably roll those up into 3 categories: technical, problem solving, and communication. And I asked them backstage, I said, if you had to drop one of them, Like if you couldn't get all three, which one would you drop? And there was some dissension backstage. So why don't we start? What would you drop, Jen?
I think that's a really tough question, because do you want to drop any of those? But Jen and I were talking backstage. You can tell whether you can measure for technical aptitude. So maybe someone doesn't know all of the technical skill sets right now that they need in the role, but you can still measure, do they have kind of the quantitative mindset? But I think the most important piece is whether someone is collaborative. Because the biggest mistake I've seen with hiring for data scientists is measuring for all these technical abilities. Can you explain this algorithm to me? But then they're not great to work with. At the end of the day, they still have to work with the team. And if someone's a huge jerk, they're still toxic to the team regardless how smart they are.
Yeah. May?
I think, the most important one is problem solving. If you have a problem solver, whatever is the problem, he's going to go and work and get the resources to fix the problem, to find the answer, to do that. Although I'm very technical, I would drop technical, of course, because, you can train for technical. And I believe, analysts, not all analysts should have a background in, data science or data mining or, statistical background. I mean, you can train for that, or you can outsource some of that. But, the main important skill is that someone is collaborative, of course, and is a problem solver. And that is the most important skill when you want to collaborate with other team members.
Yeah, I would say, so for context, my team is customer-facing, so they go out externally and present, whether that's directly at customer meetings or it could be like panels, events. So for me, I'm always highly over-indexing on communication skills. I think to Jen's first point, like if I can get all three, that's what I'm aiming for in terms of like you start with a ideal persona of a candidate and of a hire, but from my experience, if I think about longer-term success in the roles on my team, I would be willing to train for technical, because my experience has been it is a lot harder to train on what they call the soft skills, which makes them sound less important, which I think is completely wrong. They're so essential. But somebody who struggles to articulate the key insight from a data point, somebody who really does not like engaging with customers and a sales team, someone who sort of struggles to pull together insights into a coherent story, they will struggle in the role. And whereas if you take someone in who needs to be trained technically, who needs to spend time in that, their ramp up may be slower, but if they're comfortable in the technical piece, they will probably over the medium term actually perform higher in the role. And each role is different, and I think we also mentioned that seniority level also plays a role too in thinking about, what are you hiring for this person to do exactly? But my sense has been that from an analytics and insights perspective, you need really effective communicators, really do.
And I would actually chime in on that and say that willingness to learn and be trained is really important as well.
Yeah.
Because if they're willing to go home and read and practice programming, that is so important too. Because if they don't have the technical capability, but I believe that they will spend the time and be excited about learning it, that is really key.
Yeah. That's actually a good point. Yeah, we do actually feed that into the interview process. If we know someone does not have the technical skill set, we'll actually purposely have questions around that. So it could be just simply, tell me a time where you wanted to do something but you didn't have the skills to do it. What approach did you take? Have you ever had to train yourself on something? Or I think a lot of within the industry, a lot of people now talk about the growth mindset, and so that idea of that you as a professional approach throughout your career, the idea of constant learning and ongoing development, and so assessing for how people think about ongoing development and their ongoing skill sets. But yeah, good point to factor that in.
And so full disclosure, Jen B has a PhD in political science.
It's very relevant to helping, sell advertising.
So translatable skills is what you're really talking about, especially as it relates to sharing the business insights. So I'm going to toss this to the audience. We're right on time as to where we wanted to be. There are some microphones that are moving. There's a question right there in the middle. We'll start there, the pink.
So I'm curious, how centralized are your various organizations? enterprise, business unit, on down? And how do you remain connected with the businesses to help them formulate their problems as well as identify unmet problems?
So 2 questions there. Who wants to tackle the first one? Did you hear them?
I think it's working now. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's working. Yes, we're good. We're good. So centralized, enterprise versus not. When do you start?
My organization rolls up to the CFO, so it's very centralized with regards to the fact that we're often trying to drive value in terms of revenue, and we report to the CFO, so that's very relevant. And I would say that my leadership does a fantastic job of staying really engaged with the business and partnering, and then at least having some kind of initial dialogue when we get a request to make sure that we understand what decision is being made with the data that we're providing.
Yeah. And the session right after this, Kathleen Maleys is going to do a deep dive into that. So if you're interested in that, that's a good one to come to. So,
Okay.
Any other?
So my role is in consulting. So we work with clients, which sometimes we see how they're not, they're when they ask the questions or when we get requests or projects, we focus on bringing everyone to the conversation, and we make sure that we're just not dealing with the IT team or just the marketing, because it's a bigger conversation. And bringing everyone, having that kind of diverse audience to the project or your data science project brings the value. And you cannot see the value if you can't hear from everyone in the organization.
So our insights team actually sits within the sales organization. So pretty much across my team, we are mapped to sales leaders at different levels. And so we try as best as we can to align to the priorities of the sales team. I think the way to think about it is that whether you're in the sales organization or in the insights organization, you're generally starting with very high-level priorities, and hopefully they align, and then you cascade down to the different levels, and you seek alignment at each level as well, but you're still tying back to something greater. And I think the second part of that, I see, particularly at the leadership level, I see the role both as how do I take the needs of the business and figure out the best way that I feel insights can help meet those needs and meet specific needs, and maybe other areas where I'm like, I don't think insights is the best team to handle that. But the other side of it is I do believe in identifying opportunities where insights can add value that I should not necessarily expect a sales partner to determine that. And so I think you need to do both. I think you need to be proactive, bringing possible ideas, make it clear why that's a good idea, where you see the value, why the insights team should allocate time to that versus something else. But then you also need to figure out that this business probably has some initial challenges, and you should be seeking ways to help resolve those as well.
And I think Jen made a great point about the levels of the organization. I think that oftentimes people left out of the conversations during the actual analytics projects are the independent contributor level people that are involved with the process being analyzed. And so we have a high-level view of what we think the standard operating procedures are, which we know everyone follows standard operating procedures 100% of the time, right? But then we forget to ask the people that actually deal with that process on a day-to-day basis or who are generating the actual data. And then that context kind of gets lost. And maybe the pain point is a little bit different than what the stakeholder level people think it is. So I think that's a great point to engage multiple levels when you're doing a project.
Great. So we've got one in the back and then 2 in the front. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. I just want to return to your conversation about the 3 skill sets that are so important for analytics and data science. It occurs to me that it seemed like while there was, there maybe not have been consensus on which was the most important, it seemed that there was agreement that technical skills were the least required coming in. At the very least, you need to have a technical aptitude, perhaps. How does this correspond with the typical application process, given that soft skills are very difficult to accurately reflect on a resume, and it's very common for a list of required technical skills to be prerequisite, and if it's not on the resume, it won't even get through to the hiring manager.
I mean, one of the ways I know one of our positions that we hire for usually ask you to do a little like JavaScript test or something. And, the point of that is not seeing your code that it's perfect or, that technical, little project you did follows exactly the standard. Is the way you try to do it, is the approach that how people, do it. So your technical skills doesn't just fall into, you did this right, or you didn't, it works, or it doesn't. It's how you try to do it, is if you try to solve that problem, and if you did enough research to actually solve it. So it is important to have a technical background, It's important to know the terms, because, if you bring someone who has no technical background, it might be, very hard to bring them up to speed. And, you need to someone who have a technical expertise or, background because they have interest in that technical field that you're hiring for.
Yeah, I would say so specifically on your question, my response there would be that's where it's critical that you as a hiring manager are engaging with your recruiting partner. So if you're willing to accept someone as a candidate, but you haven't communicated that to your recruiting partner, and therefore they are looking at a set of skills and requirements, then that's just a disconnect that I feel needs to be fixed. And so I purposely ensure that my job description has very, very high up in terms of what we're looking for is experience with either communicating to internal or external stakeholders, various other soft skills that we try and highlight, and that basic qualifications do not have to be, high levels of technical experience. We may specify analytical, which could mean a kind of a broad range of things, but not necessarily putting a list of technical skill sets into the fundamental basic qualifications. So that's kind of job description design by intent.
And if you're the candidate in that situation, use your network and try to meet someone from that company and maybe seek feedback on maybe if it's not right now, what can I do to make myself competitive in the future for that role?
Okay, there's one more right in that, and then we're going to come down here, Reagan, next. Go ahead.
Hey, I love the conversation, and I would like to have my question around the last page, blueprint that May proposed. That's what I have when I manage my program, but I'm curious, how long does it take for you to get to the goal, to get to a clear defined success criteria that on your KPI page, and how long does it take for you to get all the data you need? Thank you.
So, it depends on how many objectives you have, how big is your business, of course, but how long does it take? It's important to do this as an active process and not just, you send emails and you try to do this offline. I'd love to do what I call as a think tank. So I bring people from the tech, from, the business, from even marketing people, sales, everyone, even customer support, everyone who's involved in that, business, to come and have a think tank where we can produce this sometimes in one setting. And then after we produce it, usually we share it with everyone, get the feedback and maybe have a review session, and then you lock it down. And like I said, it's a living document. So every quarter, every time you have new objectives, change in your business, you review that.
Thank you.
Is this on? Great. So a lot of times during the data science process, you may hit, as a data scientist, a lot of what business would refer to as end of the road in your experimentation. So, you can't generate relationships amongst data. So how do you communicate that the project's going to take a bit longer, or you're not finding exactly what you thought you would find? And how do you keep them engaged in that extended process where you started off at 2 months as an estimated timeline, but now it's 4 months, 5 months, because you're trying to find something in the data and keep them engaged during that process and not discouraged.
Jen?
So back when I was a consultant, I think that my best projects were when I successfully established a partnership with my client stakeholders from the start. And I met with them regularly and kept them up to date on what I was finding, what roadblocks I was having, and then brought them into the conversation about how to overcome those roadblocks, which served a couple purposes. First of all, they know more about the business than I do, so their feedback was very invaluable about what I was seeing and where I could pivot. But then secondly, it was more like they were on my team versus me having to deliver the bad news of needing to take longer. We were on the same side. We were fighting the same battle. So I think that's what I would recommend in that scenario if possible.
I agree with that. I mean, it's mainly about involvement of your stakeholders and transparency with them. If you're transparent and they know how the project is actually going, there'll be more understanding, and they'll actually do what they can to help you to face those roadblocks.
Yeah, I would say the one thing I have noticed over the years is that sometimes the negative reaction from our partners or stakeholders is not necessarily that the project in and of itself is not meeting certain deadlines or is taking longer. It's that people don't like uncertainty. So if they think something is coming and then they hear quite last minute that no, it's not, and I always say this to my team as well, remember that our internal stakeholders are dealing with our customers. So you tell them, oh, sorry, that thing's not going to be ready that you thought you were going to have tomorrow. They then have to go and tell a customer potentially that a meeting may have to be moved or something that the customer thought was going to get. So also realize that there's knock-on effects. So it's all about minimizing uncertainty, I think. I think you don't need to be overly technical. You don't need to go in and explain every single issue as to why this is not working. I think keeping them informed and keeping open channels of communication is key, but just minimizing uncertainty for them. They know the next step and they have advance notice has often worked, I think, to sort of help with that sense of, okay, I'm still interested and I trust what you're saying to me. So
There was another one down front right here. I can hear you and I can repeat it if you want to.
Collecting all the data.
So can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so her question was, a lot of clients or, organizations like to collect all the data and then, kind of think of insights that they want to look at. And I get that a lot, from our clients. Let's track everything. And, we have the space. We have terabytes. But, while that is very easy to think about or, very enticing, but if you think about it, and I remember an article that I read in Harvard Business Review that was written in the 60s, before analytics was even there, which said, having lost sight of our objectives, we doubled our efforts. So when you don't start with your objectives, you're spending a lot of effort and a lot of time. You're tracking everything. That means you have to QA so many things instead of just the ones that you focused. Your implementation will have, instead of 100 hours, you'll have 500 hours. So think about the resources, the budgets that you have, the investment, the analytics investment that you need to make. So, focusing on your objectives gives you the results that you need and gives you a direction. When your analytics strategy becomes an afterthought, it's harder to look at the results that helps you get the value of data science adoption and the fruit of the analytics that you have. Always think that I want to know why my business exists. And when you start with that, you know exactly what you want to measure to improve your business and see the return on your analytics investment.
I'll just add that from one perspective I have is I always say, is your question an ocean? Is your question a Great Lake, or is your question a pond? Because if I have a pond question, I know where to look for the data a lot faster than if it's an ocean question, which might be, how do we improve sales? Could be the ocean. How do we improve sales in the Northwest? How do we improve sales in the Northwest in the fourth quarter around, women's perfume? Right? You're going to have a much better objective answer when you can get them to iterate with you down that funnel. We have time for one more. Right in the middle. Can we bring him a microphone? Right smack in the middle. Right here. She can't see you. Thank you.
This will be our last question.
That's right.
Thank you.
Better be good. Just kidding.
Just want to ask a follow-up question to what Jennifer just discussed about certainty and the risk. I came from an analytics background, and what I'm trying to say is when I deal with this type of certainty or risk situation, a technical person may address it a little differently. Like I will do a technical spike and see if a certain technical solution works for this case as a minimal step to future success, more like a MVP type of a trial to see if it's working for this bigger problem. What are the other types of uncertainty and risks in your work, and what are the ways that you try to effectively address them? Because I think addressing uncertainty and risk is really important for building this long-term trust with collaborators. So just wondering, what are the other ways you effectively address the uncertainty, and what type of uncertainty is the most common in your work? Thank you.
Did you hear that?
I think so. So I don't know if we have time to go in very in depth, but I mean, in terms of uncertainty in the role, I think the core areas for us are just actually, as Reagan had sort of mentioned, sometimes the results don't look the way someone had hoped they would, and so how do you go through that process where maybe there's a chance to do a revision, or it's like these are the results, and so how do we then work on the communication and storytelling of positioning that? The other uncertainty piece for us is also probably just data infrastructure and the reliability of tools internally. Sometimes we wake up some morning and we've been told that, your team can't access this self-serve tool. So how do we work through that process in terms of communicating, what the bug is, when do we think it's going to be fixed, what's the timeline? I think uncertainty in those situations is you just need a good communication process to make sure that gets to your stakeholders and they understand next steps as much as possible. So that would be the main one.
Okay, thank you for that question. Thank you for all of your attention. Let's give our panel a round of applause for bringing their best selves to Don't go anywhere. Just hold on. I'll just make a quick announcement before we exit that the next session will start at 9:45. Back to the technical room in the bays. The intro session back in the AHW room. Strategy will stay in here. For those of you that want more of that conversation around setting expectations, this is the place to stay with Kathleen Maley from KeyBank. Not to take away from the other two presentations, which are also terrific. So thank you again, and we'll see you back shortly.